During this, we are going to talk about the Petty and Grand Apartheid laws and how they were opposed during the Defiance campaign. First, we're going to talk about Petty Apartheid. Petty Apartheid is racial segregation that is enforced primarily in public, including transportation, hotels, and restaurants.
Two examples of petty apartheid laws that I found in South Africa were the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act of 1953 and the Native Labor (Settlement of Disputes Act of 1953. Both of these laws encouraged segregation in public places or facilities, including privately owned and even privately owned businesses. So the first act that I investigated was the Native Labor Settlement of Disputes Act of 1953. This act was passed by the oppressive government to restrict the rights of native South Africans to unionize. A union for the South African people would have been very effective because they could have advocated for stronger rights. However, by passing this law, it created a further divide between the whites and non-whites in public facilities and businesses, as the blacks could not advocate for better working facilities or for the desegregation of the workplace. The Reservation of Separate Amenities Act of 1953 is perhaps the most blatant and profound act passed to encourage segregation in the apartheid system. It segregated all public facilities, including the beaches. As depicted below, the shore was segregated into white and non-white areas, and this was just one example of the many segregatory apartheid acts passed during this time period.
Grand Apartheid. The definition of Grand Apartheid refers to the racial segregation that placed limitations on native South Africans' access to land and political rights through systematic laws. Two apartheid laws. First, the Natives Urban Areas Act, and secondly, Separate Representation of Voters Act of 1951. Natives Urban Area Act. This act set up systems such as mandatory passes to control and monitor the movement of natives between urban and rural areas. This picture depicts two women holding signs, one that said, "Women do not want passes," and the second one says, "With passes we are slaves." This act represents Grand Apartheid as it stripped natives their right to move freely and controlled their movement. This impeded on the freedoms of native South Africans because it limited where they could live, work, and travel. Instead, it gave more power to the government. Separate Representation of Voters Act of 1951. Together with the 1956 amendment, this act led to the removal of coloreds from common voter rolls. In this picture, it depicts protesters holding a sign, "Votes for All." This policy impacted native South Africans as it stripped them of their right to vote and gave them no say into the laws that were being created, limiting their freedoms.
The Defiance campaign in 1952 was the first large-scale nonviolent mobilization against the apartheid laws by all racial groups. It was led by the joint leadership of the African National Congress, South African Indian Congress, and the Colored People's Congress. During this time, Alfred Lutuli was in charge of the African National Congress. In the short time of the campaign, it grew quite large. Over 8,500 volunteers were arrested when protesting. The South African government responded to the campaign with stricter laws and policies. Although the campaign did not extinguish the apartheid laws, it did gain international attention, such as the United Union's recognition of the South African racial policy as an international issue. During the Defiance campaign, the people took action against the unjust laws. Here are some examples of the way they went against petty apartheid laws in South Africa. For the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act, they failed to follow regulations that kept races apart, such as European-only areas. A specific example is in Port Elizabeth, where protesters entered waiting rooms designated for whites. In addition, many refused to work in opposition of the Native Labor Act. In terms of Grand Apartheid, protesters burned passbooks and refused to use them in opposition of the Native Urban Areas Act. This was demonstrated in many places, such as Boiksburg. For the separate representation of voters, the Defiance campaign overall showed opposition to the act because they were organizing huge rallies and demonstrations demanding their voice back. All in all, the Defiance campaign was the first large-scale nonviolent mobilization against the apartheid laws that called upon all sections of the population regardless of color and creed.